I am 38 years old. I work as a senior financial analyst. I spend my days forecasting risk, modeling worst-case scenarios, and pretending that control is something you can actually achieve if you plan hard enough. And for years, I thought that discipline extended to my personal life too, until one completely ordinary conversation exposed how little space I actually occupied in my own marriage. It happened on a Tuesday night in October, not during an argument, not during therapy, not during some dramatic blowout, but while we were cleaning up after dinner, plates dry on the rack, the dishwasher humming in the background, the kind of quiet domestic moment that is supposed to feel safe. I casually mentioned that maybe this year we could host Thanksgiving for my parents, just the four of them and us. Nothing big, nothing dramatic, just a simple idea spoken out loud, without any emotional charge behind it. My parents live 2 hours away. They are getting older, and I realized it had been years since they had spent a major holiday with us, because every single holiday without exception had been automatically reserved for Emily's family. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't even pause what she was doing. She just said no, calmly, clearly, and with the kind of certainty that stops a conversation dead on arrival. She told me that Thanksgiving is for her family, and that it has always been that way, and that it was not something she was willing to change. I tried to laugh it off at first, thinking she misunderstood me. So I explained that I wasn't suggesting canceling her family plans forever, just maybe alternating one year, or even doing a lunch with them and dinner with mine. She finally turned to look at me then, and her expression wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was neutral, like the decision had been made a long time ago, and my suggestion was simply irrelevant. That was when she said the sentence that I haven't been able to forget since. She said her family comes first. Not more often. Not this year. Not usually. First. Always. Non-negotiable. She said it the same way someone explains gravity or the speed of light, as if it were a basic law of the universe that I was foolish for questioning. I stood there holding a damp plate in my hands, suddenly aware of how small the kitchen felt, how quiet the room had become, how loud my own thoughts were. In that moment it hit me that this wasn't about Thanksgiving at all. It was about the fact that in 10 years of marriage, I had never once hosted a holiday for my side of the family, never once pushed back when plans were made without me, never once questioned why my parents were expected to accommodate our schedule, while hers were treated like the default setting. As I replayed the past in my head, patterns started lining up with painful clarity. Christmas mornings always at her parent house, even when my mother begged us to come just once. Easter brunches planned before I even knew the date. Birthdays, anniversaries, long weekends, all quietly absorbed into her family's orbit while mine slowly learned to stop asking every time I brought up before. It was framed as convenience, proximity, tradition, but now I could see that convenience was just another word for priority. And tradition was just an excuse that benefited only one side. I didn't argue with her that night. I finished the dishes, wiped down the counters, and went to bed like nothing had happened. But something had cracked open inside me. I realized that I had been negotiating my own place in this marriage without ever knowing it, trading small pieces of myself for peace, mistaking silence for compromise, and calling it maturity. That single conversation stripped away the illusion that we were partners balancing each other, because partners don't rank families like a hierarchy chart, and they don't declare one side untouchable while the other learns to live with disappointment. Lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I understood for the first time that the issue wasn't a holiday. It was that I had slowly accepted being second without ever being told. And now that it had finally been said out loud, I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it. After she said it, after the words settled into the air between us and there was nothing left to misunderstand, I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself, and I didn't try to negotiate my way back into a conversation that had already been closed. I just went quiet. Not the passive-aggressive kind of quiet. Not the sulking kind either. But the kind that happens when something fundamental shifts and your mind starts rearranging reality without asking for permission. I nodded, finished the last of the dishes, and followed our usual routine as if nothing significant had happened. But internally, I was replaying my entire marriage like a financial audit where the numbers suddenly stopped adding up. I thought about the vacations I had canceled without complaint because her parents needed help or her sister had another crisis that couldn't possibly wait. I remembered the trip to Italy I had planned for our 5th anniversary that turned into a weekend road trip instead, because Emily's sister needed money again and we should be available just in case. I remembered wiring thousands of dollars on short notice, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, always framed as temporary, always urgent, always justified by family. I thought about the house we bought in the same town as her parents because it made sense for everyone, except no one ever asked whether it made sense for me. Every major decision we had made together suddenly looked less like compromise and more like a consistent pattern, where her family's needs were treated as immovable facts and mine as flexible suggestions. That night, Emily fell asleep quickly, peacefully, the way someone does when they believe the world is exactly as it should be. I lay there next to her, staring into the dark, not angry, not even sad in the way I expected, but clear a way that felt almost clinical. Anger would have been easier, because anger burns hot and then fades, but clarity stays. I realized I wasn't dealing with a disagreement. I was dealing with a hierarchy, and I was not the top of it. So I didn't confront her, and I didn't vent to friends, and I didn't pour a drink to dull the feeling. I reached for my laptop. Years in finance had trained me to respond to risk with information, not emotion, and that instinct kicked in automatically. I started reading about legal separation, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I needed to understand my position. I read about asset division, about how shared finances are untangled, about what financial independence looks like. When you have spent a decade merging every decision with someone else's priorities, I reviewed our accounts, our investments, our liabilities, not with resentment, but with the same detached focus I use at work when I'm stress testing a portfolio. It wasn't revenge I was planning, and it wasn't an exit I had emotionally committed to yet. It was survival. It was making sure that if I ever needed to stand on my own, I could do so without collapsing under the weight of years spent minimizing myself. As the house stayed quiet and the night stretched on, I understood something that took me far too long to see. Love doesn't erase imbalance, and loyalty that only flows in one direction eventually turns into obligation. By the time I closed my laptop and finally slept, I wasn't resolved, but I was awake in a way I had never been before, and that awareness was something I knew I couldn't unlearn. Once the decision settled quietly in my chest, I didn't make any grand moves or dramatic declarations, because drama would have tipped my hand, and I wasn't ready for that. So instead, I did what I've always done best, which is plan in silence. I opened a personal bank account in my own name and set it up to receive a portion of my paycheck. Nothing obvious, nothing aggressive, just enough to begin creating separation where there had been none. I documented every dollar I moved, every transfer, every change, not because I felt guilty, but because I understood that clarity protects you when emotions inevitably enter the room later. I scheduled a meeting with a financial planner under the pretense of long-term optimization, and for the first time in years, I talked about my future as an individual rather than half of a unit, which felt strange and grounding at the same time. I increased my retirement contributions quietly, redirecting money that had once disappeared into shared obligations and family emergencies that were never actually emergencies for me. I built an emergency fund with intention, calculating how many months of independence I would need to breathe if everything changed overnight. I mapped out what my life would look like without Emily, not in an angry way, not in a fancy way, but in the same realistic, spreadsheet-driven manner I use when forecasting downside risk. Housing costs, insurance, lifestyle adjustments, the kind of details people ignore until it's too late. I put all of it on paper because numbers don't lie even when people do. What surprised me most was how easy it became once I stopped announcing myself. I didn't argue when her sister called with another financial problem. I simply said we couldn't help this time and let the silence sit where an explanation was expected. I didn't rush to cover expenses that were never discussed with me in advance, and I didn't refill accounts that were being drained by decisions I didn't participate in. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just opting out of problems that were never mine to solve. Emily noticed the changes, of course, but without a confrontation to latch onto, there was nothing for her to fight. Only a subtle shift in the way resources flowed. Each step I took made me feel less trapped and more present, like I was slowly reclaiming oxygen after years of shallow breathing. I still came home at the same time, still ate dinner at the same table, still lived the same outward life, but internally I was no longer dependent on an arrangement that had been quietly draining me. For the first time in a long while, my financial decisions reflected my actual priorities rather than inherited ones, and as that foundation solidified beneath me, I realized that independence isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just grows steadily in the background until one day you look up and realize you're no longer afraid of standing alone. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was finishing up a report. Emily's voice sharp and rushed the moment she stepped through the door, already halfway into the crisis before I even knew what happened. Her sister had messed up again, bad decisions stacked on top of old ones. Credit cards maxed out, rent overdue, some vague but urgent threat that everything would fall apart unless money appeared immediately. I listened without interrupting, not because I was numb, but because for the first time I was actually hearing it clearly, the familiar script where panic automatically translated into my responsibility. Emily didn't ask whether we could help. She didn't frame it as a discussion. She just said we would pull from the joint savings like it was a reflex, like gravity. like the money was already gone and my role was simply to approve the motion. I waited until she finished, until the air settled, and then I said no. Not loudly, not defensively, just calmly, the same way she had shut down my Thanksgiving suggestion weeks earlier. I told her I wasn't comfortable using the joint savings for this, that I wouldn't be contributing, and that she was free to help however she saw fit with her own resources. She stared at me like I had spoken another language, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then anger, as if refusal itself was a personal betrayal. She demanded an explanation, so I gave her one, and I didn't dress it up or soften it. I simply reminded her of her own words, that her family comes first, that it's non-negotiable, and that since that was the structure we were operating under, it made sense for her to handle this without assuming my participation. The silence that followed was heavy and brittle, the kind that feels like it might shatter if touched. She accused me of being cold, of abandoning her in a moment of need, of changing, and I didn't argue with any of it because none of it was the point. The point was that for the first time, I wasn't stepping into a problem that wasn't mine. And she had no framework for that reality. She stormed out of the room, furious, already reaching for her phone, probably calling her sister or her parents, already rewriting the story in a way that made sense to her, while I stayed where I was, steady, grounded, and strangely calm. After she left, I logged into our shared account and transferred the remaining funds I contributed into my personal account, carefully, cleanly, leaving a clear record of every move. It wasn't done in anger, and it wasn't meant as a punishment. It was simply the final step in aligning my actions with the reality I had finally accepted. As the confirmation screen loaded, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief exactly, but certainty, the kind that comes when you stop betraying yourself to keep the peace. When Emily came back later that night, still tense and distant, nothing more was said, but everything had changed because the unspoken understanding was now unavoidable. The automatic safety net was gone, and for the first time in our marriage, I had chosen myself without asking for permission. It happened weeks later on an ordinary Sunday morning when nothing else was wrong, no crisis, no raised voices, just coffee cooling on the counter and Emily sitting at the kitchen table scrolling on her phone before she suddenly froze, her thumb stopping mid-motion, her eyes narrowing in a way I recognized immediately. She refreshed the screen, then opened the banking app again, then looked up at me slowly like she was trying to decide whether what she was seeing was a glitch or a threat. She asked me why the savings account balance was so low, her voice tight, but still controlled, as if she expected a simple explanation that would restore order. I told her calmly that it wasn't low, it was accurate, and that I had withdrawn my contributions over the past few weeks. At first she laughed, a sharp, humorless sound, assuming I was joking, but when I didn't smile back, she demanded to know what I meant by my contributions, because in her mind the account belonged to us in a way that didn't require math. I sat down across from her and explained it the same way I would explain a contract clause or a financial discrepancy at work. Slowly, clearly, without emotion. I showed her the records, the deposits I had made over the years, the transfers I executed, the dates, the amounts, the paper trail that left no room for interpretation. I told her I hadn't touched a dollar that wasn't mine, that everything was documented, and that what remained in the account reflected her contributions alone. That was when she exploded. She accused me of sneaking behind her back, of betraying our marriage, of being selfish and calculating, of turning money into a weapon, her words piling on top of each other faster than I could have responded even if I wanted to. She said couples don't do this to each other, that I had broken trust, that I was acting like a stranger in my own home. I listened without interrupting, noticing how none of her accusations actually addressed the facts, only the shock of losing access to something she had always assumed was available. The anger wasn't about the money itself. It was about the sudden loss of certainty, the realization that the safety net she relied on wasn't automatic anymore. When she finally paused, waiting for me to defend myself or apologize or backtrack, I didn't raise my voice or argue the details again, because there was no point. I just looked at her and said one sentence, evenly, without sarcasm or malice, that I was just respecting the hierarchy she explained to me. The effect was immediate. Her anger stalled, replaced by stunned silence, like I had held up a mirror she hadn't realized existed. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed again, because for the first time there was nothing to contradict without unraveling her own words. Then she told me the amount they needed, and I could hear the expectation underneath the words, the assumption that this was still my role, that emergencies automatically erased lines and restored access. I took a breath and said no, not abruptly, not dismissively, just clearly. I told her I couldn't help financially, that I hoped her father recovered, but that this wasn't something I was going to fund. The silence on the line was sharp, like she had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. When she found her voice again, it came out harsh, accusing me of being cruel, of abandoning her family in their worst moment, of proving that I had become someone cold and unrecognizable. I didn't argue with her version of events. I explained calmly that boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection, and that I wasn't withdrawing money out of spite or revenge, but because I had already stepped out of a system where my resources were treated as communal property, without mutual consideration. I reminded her that I had spent years responding to emergencies that were never mine, and that stepping back now didn't erase my empathy. It just acknowledged my limits. She said marriage meant sacrifice, even now, even after separation had begun, and I told her quietly that sacrifice without reciprocity isn't partnership, it's erosion. Her frustration turned to desperation, then to anger again, cycling through the same patterns I'd lived inside for years, and I realized there was nothing left to say that would land where it needed to. I wished her father well one last time, told her I hoped she had support, and ended the call before the conversation could spiral into something familiar and damaging. Afterward, I blocked her number, not as an act of cruelty, but as a final act of consistency, because protecting the life I was rebuilding required silence where guilt used to live. When the phone went dark in my hand, I felt the weight of the moment, not relief, not pride, just a quiet certainty that choosing myself no longer required justification. A year later, my life looks quieter from the outside, but that quiet is a result of deliberate choices rather than absence, and it's the most stable I have ever felt. Financially, I am steady in a way I never was before, not because I suddenly earn more, but because every dollar I manage now serves a life I actually live instead of patching holes in someone else's. My accounts are simple, my plans are mine, and the constant background anxiety that used to follow every phone notification has disappeared. Emotionally, I am calm in a way that once felt impossible, because I am no longer bracing myself for the next emergency or negotiating my worth through sacrifice. I am dating someone new, someone independent, someone who solves her own problems and respects the fact that I solve mine, and there is no confusion about where responsibility begins and ends. There is no expectation that love requires depletion, no unspoken hierarchy waiting to be enforced, just mutual presence without ownership. It isn't dramatic or intense, but it is honest, and honesty turns out to be far more sustaining than intensity ever was. Through mutual acquaintances and the occasional unavoidable update, I know Emily's life hasn't changed in the same way. Her days are still dominated by her family's needs, one crisis bleeding into the next, always urgent, always justified, always consuming whatever resources she has left. The structure she chose remains intact, and she continues to live inside it exactly as she always said she would. Months ago, she sent me an email, not angry, not pleading, but reflective in a way that surprised me. She wrote that she finally understood what I'd been saying, that she could see now how the imbalance had shaped our marriage, and that in many ways I had been right. In the same breath, she admitted she still wouldn't choose differently, that her family would always come first. Even knowing the cost, I read the message once and didn't respond. Not out of bitterness, not to prove a point, but because there was nothing left to resolve. Her honesty didn't require my validation, and my peace didn't require her agreement. Some truths don't need closure, they just need acceptance. I closed the email, went back to my life, and felt no urge to explain myself anymore. The story doesn't end with vindication or reconciliation, it ends with alignment. I chose myself fully and without apology, and for the first time that choice isn't temporary or conditional. It's permanent, and it finally feels like home.